Gil Kerlikowske, Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So you've been in charge of U.S. border security now for 2.5 years. And before that, you were in charge of drug policy. You've also been the police chief in Seattle and Buffalo, two big border cities. So you know the border between Canada and the U.S. really, really well. What is your assessment now, 15 years after 9/11, of the state of border security on the northern border?
First, even though I was in Buffalo well before 9/11, I mean, the relationship in the border security with the Canadian border and the United States is one that has been continually progressing. The information sharing, the level of technology, the cooperation and the communication have all really, really improved, and particularly since 9/11.
But in recent years, there's a perception here in the United States. I was just speaking with a U.S. journalist who said, you know, we focus so much on Mexico, but really the terrorist and security threats are between the U.S. and Canada. Do you share that assessment, or is that a misperception that some Americans have?
Well, I think the misperception is that that we're always going to be able to secure a border 100%. And when you look at the size of the United States, you look at particularly the length of the Canadian border, it would be absolutely impossible. That's why everything we do in Customs and Border Protection is based upon risk. Assessment of risk, information sharing between two cooperating countries and cooperating law enforcement agencies, those are the things that make us safer, not trying to build a wall.
And what do you think about that whole proposal about building a wall? Is that something that is even possible?
Well, I think one, particularly with our southern border with Mexico, we have over 600 miles of fencing, a variety of fencing. We also, when you look at the environment and you look at the terrain, you pretty much realize that building a wall would be, one, nearly impossible from an engineering feat. We spend a lot of money repairing the fencing just because of natural disasters, flooding, things like that. So having a wall versus trying to use smart, risk-based assessments, building the wall probably would not make a lot of sense.
Well, given the nature of the Canadian border with the United States, in some places it actually runs through a building, a library in one place. It runs alongside downtown Detroit. Then you've got all these big open spaces out west. Would it even be feasible if someone wanted to do that, to build a wall on the Canada-U.S. border?
I don't think it would be feasible, and particularly for those when you travel in Montana, parts of Idaho, and certainly North Dakota. There are a number of places where you don't even really recognize where the border is because this is all pretty much, well, close to virgin land.
So what do you do there to patrol that border when it's this vast expanse?
So we increased the number of Border Patrol agents on the northern border pretty significantly, and we have well over 2,000 agents in that area. But we also try to use the technology, unmanned aircraft, and of course helicopters and other type of aircraft. But again, I think I'd go back to the other important part is sharing the information about who may present a danger to either country or who may be involved in smuggling. For Canada particularly, it's untaxed cigarettes. For the United States, it can be some of the synthetic drugs. Those are all things we really have to look at very closely.
And do you feel you're getting the information that you need from Canada, or is there more information you'd like to have about who's traveling?
Well, after 9/11 and particularly the issues that came up during the rendition hearing, I think there was a bit of a chilling effect between governments and between law enforcement agencies when it came to sharing information. I think that's changed quite a bit.
A chilling effect because Canadians were worried it would be misused?
Yes, and also the particular incident involving the head of the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, there were issues that came up. And, you know, how do you balance privacy with national security? And I think we found a very good way with the Canadians to thread that needle.
And what about information such as no-fly lists, where Canadians feel they're ending up on U.S. no-fly lists and are not sure how to get off of them? Is this something that can be improved?
Well, I think the information can always be improved about if, in fact, you've been taken in, for example, into secondary. You come into the United States, you think you're going to go right through the passport control, and then you're asked additional questions, etc. You should be able to find out what was the cause of that and how did that happen. For people that have been denied things like global entry or a Nexus card or others, there are ways to inquire through our web portal, through the Department of Homeland Security, if there is something that is changed. And quite often it isn't something really significant. It can be a number was transposed or information was not put in the right location. And so rather than be concerned like, oh, I was denied entry or I'm on a no-fly list for some reason, take a look and see what the real problem is first.
Well, recently there was a case of a Canadian who was trying to cross into the United States and was asked if he'd ever smoked marijuana, and it turned out that he was then not only denied entry but banned permanently from coming into the U.S. Given that the Trudeau government intends to legalize marijuana in Canada, what advice do you have to Canadians traveling to the U.S. about disclosing past marijuana use, or is this going to cause you difficulties down the line if marijuana is legalized in Canada?
Well, one, I can't really comment particularly on that case, in the individual case, because there are a number of other cases that also come up on a regular basis. For instance, people with mental health issues or people being treated with mental health. So we have some older rules and regulations, but also Canada does. And we need to sit down together and look at those because we really want to facilitate that travel and not make it difficult for people to come into or out of the United States.
So you're saying you'd be in favor of maybe revisiting some of these rules between the two governments?
Well, we've always revisited them. The rules come up periodically for review, but in particular, those incidents involving, as you know, in the United States, there's a huge focus on mental health services. But we also ask particular questions about mental illness, etc. And those rules and regulations have been in place. They always need to be reviewed.
And what is the forum for that? Is that something the Prime Minister should be raising with the President, or is this at your level, at the official level? How would these marijuana laws, for example, be reviewed?
Well, most of these, if they're not enshrined in a particular piece of legislation, but are merely administrative rules or regulations, we also undertake that review. But frankly, the world is changing, and whether it's a part of legislation or whether it's a part of a rule review, we should be looking at that pretty closely and trying to make sure that that people in both countries can come as easily and as quickly and frankly with as little pain as possible.
Another area of difference in policy between Canada and the United States has been around the issue of Syrian refugees. And Canada took in 50,000 Syrian refugees over a very short period of time. The U.S. is aiming to take in 10,000 over a much longer period of time, longer vetting. What has this difference meant at the border? Have you had to implement any different policies, any different screening, any different concern as a result of this aggressive refugee policy in Canada?
Our review of people wanting to come into the United States has remained the same regardless of the number of refugees. But the Canadian authorities have gone to great length to explain the process. So the people being brought into Canada, if there is any hint, any concern on the part of Canadian government that that person may be of concern, they're not going to be allowed. These are also people that haven't left Syria last week, last month. These are people that have left Syria actually and could be in camps for the last several years. Also, the people being brought in are family units. Not single males. And the screening process also includes the fact that Canadian families throughout that country are willing to take someone in and help them through the process.
So you feel comfortable with the way it's been run?
Canada, I think, has done a remarkable job of looking at the people coming in very closely, and I'm comfortable with it.
And you've been working for a while with Canada on Beyond the Border. and trying to facilitate more trade and travel.
Yeah.
What would you say is the biggest legacy or accomplishment of that whole process?
Well, I think the biggest legacy would would not open a number of trucks that have cat litter in them. Those are long inspections. Cat litter is one of those things that sets off certain radiation monitors.
Cat litter.
Cat litter,
Okay.
yeah, and granite. And you can spend a lot of time looking at cat litter. So what we've done is to be able to change the algorithms in our system to be able to reduce the number of times, because all of those trucks have to be stopped, they have to be manually inspected. That slows down trade. So we've made those changes. We've made changes when the Canadian trucks are going from one part of Canada through the United States without stopping to another part of Canada. How can we get them through quickly, because they're just using the roadways? And we've made those changes. Lots of improvements in trade with Canada.
So we think a lot about border security, but the border is a big economic engine as well, with all the trade going back and forth, business travelers, freight traffic. What do you think is the answer to making the border a more smooth and less cumbersome experience for legitimate trade and travel?
Yeah, the economic responsibility that Customs and Border Protection is huge, because we have this twofold mission: border security, but also economic security. And trade is absolutely critical. So working closely with Canada, for instance, on steel that's being brought into both countries, that undermines the steel processing of our countries because it has been made more cheaply in other countries. Those are significant issues, but also speeding it up. People sometimes think that the only piece of cargo either comes across once or twice, but if you're manufacturing vehicles, other pieces of equipment, you can come across the border half a dozen times. The more quickly and expeditiously we can make that process happen, the better for the economy of both countries and better for jobs.
Do you ever just look at what's going on and say, why are we doing this? Why are we creating this red tape? Are there things that sometimes strike you as maybe outdated or unnecessary?
Well, I think the slowdowns. I mean, if you go back to certainly 9/11 in the United States, it became, and we were formed, Customs and Border Protection in 2003. It was all security all the time. And what you have to recognize is that you have to balance security with smart risk-based assessments, but you also have to recognize that you can have an important impact, either positively or negatively, on the nation's economy, on, frankly, both countries, if you're not smart about how you do trade.
Well, beyond the border has been this effort between Canada and the U.S. to use existing executive authorities to try to smoothen things out along the border. Do you think it's run its course? Is it time to look at legislative changes? For example, Congress wants you to inspect 100% of everything, and obviously you can't do that, so you try to give 100% data about every shipment. But are these the kinds of rules that maybe it's time to go back and revisit?
Well, I think that 100% scanning is something that certainly the Secretary, Congress, and others, it's been around for a while. And we have 100% scanning right now on high-risk cargo, whether it's air cargo or whether it's cargo coming in by rail or ship. Everyone knows, I think, with 70,000 containers that come into the United States every day, that you're not going to open up every one and you're not going to be able to inspect them. But we use things like large X-ray equipment, radiation portal monitors, etc. And you have to keep all of this in perspective, that these things can either slow down and hurt your economy, or you can help your economy. And how do you go about doing that?
You've had a number of pilot projects along the border. You and I visited one a while back in Buffalo at the Peace Bridge, looking at moving trucks moving U.S. officials to inspect trucks onto the Canadian side of the border. What have you learned from these pilot projects, and is any part of it going to become permanent?
Well, I think these pilots are important. The Peace Bridge particularly is of issue because no matter what you do, you still have a 3-lane bridge. And how do you move cargo and people through more quickly and more safely? So sharing space, and I think we're going to see a lot of that with the new Detroit-Windsor bridge, the Gordie Howe Bridge.
And do you think that'll actually get built?
I'm very hopeful that it will get built. The Canadian government
On a
has,
scale of 1 to 10, how hopeful are you?
I'm very hopeful that, I think we all recognize that it needs to be there. And the Canadian government has not only put up the money and the design and the structure and then the land that has been accessed. So, improving travel, improving trade, and making things move more swiftly is going to be hugely important. So I do think I'm pretty confident. But we made a lot of changes to kind of speed all of this up, but also do it in a way that recognizes safety and security.
And has it put a spotlight on the kinds of technologies that you can implement at the border, some of these pilot projects?
All the new technologies are so helpful. I mean, when we look at our international air travel, a lot of it from Canada, having pre-clearance in Canada, being able to use the Nexus card, which everyone should apply for. For $50, you get pre-check and you get Nexus and you come in much more quickly. And these are people that we don't have to spend, either Canadian government or us. We don't have to spend additional time checking them because they've already gone to the extra trouble to say, I'm a person that, frankly, that I'm safer.
Mm-hmm. And Canada and the U.S. have been working on a pre-clearance agreement for rail travel, right? For not just airports, but expanding to additional airports as well. Do you think the U.S. Congress will pass that legislation?
I do. The Land, Rail, Maritime has a lot of support, a lot of bipartisan support. I know the Canadian government is very supportive of the work that they're doing. And we all kind of recognize that given the fact that economies are not growing quite as rapidly as I think both countries would like, that if we can take essentially red tape that doesn't impact safety and security, if we can move things more quickly and people more quickly, that's better for both countries.
There's a difference constitutionally in what border guards can do when they can inspect travelers and cars that approach the border. It's very different in Canada and the United States. Do you think we'll ever have a day when there's full land border pre-clearance for truck cargo, or are these legal differences simply too big an obstacle to overcome?
Well, you have two sovereign nations with two different sets of kind of history. 9/11 for us put a huge focus on security, one that really wasn't there at the borders quite at anywhere near, frankly, the level it is today. But if we look, for instance, right now with Mexico, we have some of our people working in Tijuana. Mexican government customs officials now work in Laredo and Nogales. Those same things are very possible, I think, with Canada, but it has to be done in a way that recognizes each country's sovereignty and each country's responsibility.
What would you say is a to-do list for the next administration? Obviously, the Trudeau government has to be thinking about what they'll do in that window when there's a new president, a new administration. There'll be meetings, they'll be getting to know each other, setting the agenda that will then fill the next 4 years. What would you say should be at the top of that list when it comes to border?
Well, I think there's a real benefit in two ways with both of our governments, because even though I'll be gone at the end of this administration, the vast majority of people that have a direct impact on the relationship of customs and border protection with our counterparts in Canada are civil servants, experienced, knowledgeable people that will still be there and have been a part of these discussions. And that's very much the same way as it is with the Canadian government officials also. So they'll still be there, I think, for the very top levels of the administrations that you talked about, working through these issues, making sure that they develop good communication, good cooperation is very helpful. But I think the underlying foundation is really very good for continuing.
Is there one thing that is going to be unfinished business or something that could be taken to the next level in the coming years after you leave this post?
I think that the fact that having our officials either work in Canada and be able to pre-clear something coming well in advance, and the same way with the information sharing with the Canadian government, We'll be opening up a new national targeting center for our passengers and cargo, and it's a great way to exchange information about either people or cargo that would be of concern to either country.
So information exchange ramping up even further.
That and then, of course, technology.
Right. What about business travelers? I hear from business lawyers that it's an ongoing problem. Someone comes to the border, they're coming into Canada or coming into the US to make a deal, but they don't have the right paperwork, they don't qualify under the right interpretation of NAFTA business categories, and so they get turned away. I've heard proposals to have a 72-hour rule that you can just come in and do your business for 72 hours. Is that something within the realm of what you might contemplate here in Washington?
Well, it does get very confusing, and that's why it's the Full Employment for Lawyers Act on both sides of the border. Whether the types of visa, how long someone can stay, are they here as a student, are they here for business purposes, and very much the same way with Canada. I think there's a real need and a real push to try and simplify some of those regulations, because I know from my experience in Seattle with Boeing, a number of the engineers would be back and forth, of course, from Canada, and if they're only there for a short period of time, or what are they working on, and how can that be made better for them?
And we've talked a lot about the Canadian border, but obviously a big part of your job is the southern border with Mexico, which in a way has become an issue also about Central America, because so many of the migrants coming up through Mexico are coming out of Central America. And I understand you recently visited some of these countries. What did you see there?
Yeah, just a little while ago I went to the 3 Central American countries where the vast majority of these, what we would call unaccompanied minors, are coming from. El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras.
Are they still coming? I know you had the crisis, and how many are coming now?
So in 2014 we had 68,000, and people said, oh, this is a border security issue. Really, it was a border management issue. They were turning themselves in to our Border Patrol in green uniforms, knowing that they'd be protected. We very much are seeing the same thing. Now, our numbers this year are high.
Children without parents.
Well, or that they have a caregiver or a responsible person here in the United States.
But they're making the journey by themselves.
Oftentimes they are, and it's a dangerous journey. We try to get that message across to them. But they're coming for the same reason that people have come to the United States for decades and decades and decades. Safety, security, a better economy for their future, better educational opportunities for their children. And when I spoke at a naturalization ceremony recently for about 300 people in Boston, I mean, almost every country in the world was represented at that naturalization ceremony. And they all talked about the pride they had at becoming a naturalized United States citizen.
And what does that mean to you personally to go and see these children or to encounter refugees? I mean, it's not just policy, these are people.
Well, I have visited with a number of the families, a number of the children, and had people tell me about the reasons that they fled for a variety of things, not purely at times economic, but certainly because of violence. And I think of my wife, who was 5 when she fled Hungary with her mother and father during the revolution, during the Russian invasion. And she came in 1956 and became a United States citizen. I see what that has meant to her. It makes you very, sympathetic, and it makes you want to make sure that we have the systems in place, because frankly they contribute hugely to our economy.
So given all that, what is your reaction to the general tenor of the conversation around refugees and immigration that's going on right now in this country?
Yeah, the rhetoric around people coming into this country and the hatefulness is pretty terrible. It sends very much the wrong message. When you know people and you get to visit with them and you understand them as your neighbors and your friends, it tells you that we should be less concerned about people that want to come to the country, want to go through the naturalization process, want to benefit the economy and want to raise a family here, that we should be welcoming that. It has to be done within parameters. It has to be done with rules and regulations. But certainly, as I know from my own experience with my wife, they contributed hugely. You know, her father was a headmaster and didn't speak English. And when they came to the United States, he learned how to repair water meters. Quite a change from being a headmaster, and yet later on went to head up the section of the city of Cleveland.
But we often hear, well, we'll take more immigrants after we fix the border. What is there to fix from your perspective that needs fixing?
So we always hear about this secure the border, and then when I ask people, regardless of whether they're on the border or anywhere else, what is a secure border? I was a police chief in 2 of this country's largest cities. No one ever held me accountable for no crime. They never said, oh, if you have any crime in Seattle, you know, you're obviously not doing their job. So when you ask people to define what is a secure border, I mean, it was really only about a decade ago we had 1.6 million people coming across the southern border that were apprehended. Our numbers are below 400,000 today. So I'm not exactly sure when people say, well, we can't do anything until the border's secure, what that means.
What is the toughest part of your job?
I think keeping Customs and Border Protection, 60,000 people, out of the politics of a very heated campaign right now. We have very dedicated, very professional individuals at 338 ports of entry. We have them between the borders. We use a lot of technology, a lot of good cooperation with other governments. And I can't be in a position to allow a very good organization to become a political football over whether or not the border is secure or not secure, et cetera.
Well, Commissioner Kerlikowske, thank you so much.
Thanks.